The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning. I'm Megan McGee, and I welcome you to today's webinar from the United Methodist Foundation of Western Pennsylvania. The Foundation's vision is to build a foundation for thriving and faithful churches and agencies in Western Pennsylvania. We offer education and financial leadership and stewardship, enable planned giving opportunities in support of Christian ministries, and provide faithful and responsible funds management ministry to all churches and agencies, regardless of size. We're delighted to be bringing you another session of our webinar series today. Before I introduce today's speaker, there are some administrative items relating to your involvement. First, you should see a control box with several icons in the corner of your screen. If you want to type a question during today's session, this box needs to be expanded by clicking on the red arrow. We will then respond to your submitted questions at the end of today's prepared remarks. Also, we may pause to ask if you have any questions. At such times, if you click the gold hand symbol, we will unmute your microphone and the entire group will be able to hear your question and the answer. During the webinar, there will be polling questions. Feel free to participate in the polling questions during the webinar. Finally, the recorded webinar and slides will be available online. You will receive notification when they become available. So let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce our Executive Director, Ed Bailey, as he discusses top 10 tips for completing your pastor's IRS Form W-2. Ed is passionate about the local church and promoting best practices in Christian stewardship. He is an ordained elder in the Western PA Annual Conference, is a graduate of Roberts Wesleyan College, and has a Master of Divinity degree from the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. He holds membership in the Association of Fundraising Professionals and the National Association of Gift Planners. He is also a member of the National Association of United Methodist Foundations and serves on its management team. Prior to joining the UM Foundation, Ed was a pastor in the Western PA Annual Conference for more than 2 decades. Ed and his wife Tabitha have been married 27 years, have 4 children, and reside in Economy Borough, Beaver County, which is about 22 miles north of Pittsburgh. So now I'll go ahead and turn it over to Ed.
Thank you, Megan, for that introduction. I want to thank you also as participants for joining in this webinar. It's a great day in the neighborhood of Western Pennsylvania, and I'm so glad you've taken time out of your busy schedule to participate in this webinar. I hope it'll be helpful and informative. I want to share a little bit about the foundation and then also share some of the objectives of today's webinar. First, let me show my screen. So that you can see what I'm seeing. The United Methodist Foundation was founded in 1970. We will be celebrating our 50th anniversary in about a year and a couple months. We're looking forward to that big celebration. Also, we're a member of the National Association of United Methodist Foundations. There are about 42 United Methodist Foundations across the country, and we share resources and we share time together in moments of fellowship at our annual meeting. This past year, our annual meeting was held in Cleveland, Ohio, and it was nice to be able to go up to Cleveland and visit with all my colleagues from across the country and learn from the various speakers that we had. Also, we complement and reinforce stewardship ministries. That's what we're about. We're about helping local churches and agencies with ministries of stewardship, especially in the arena of planned giving. We're separately incorporated as a nonprofit corporation, but we're also a supporting organization of the Western Pennsylvania Annual Conference. So what do? We provide responsible and faithful investment management for churches and agencies, and we do it in a way that's consistent with the United Methodist Church's social principles. So, as part of our investment portfolio, in the funds that we manage for churches and agencies, we don't invest in those items that violate our social principles. So we avoid things like gambling, tobacco, alcohol, the top 100 defense contracts, pornography. All of those things are screened out of our portfolio, and we have creation of index funds that are customized to be able to properly make sure that we avoid those things that would not be compliant with our social principles. Also, we enable planned giving through which individuals can support Christian ministries. And people are always making planned gifts that make an impact where they're passionate about or where they feel called in areas to support. We also offer education and support in financial stewardship and leadership. It's one of the reasons why we offer these webinars. We also have a Pastors Academy. The Pastors Academy has been going on now for more than a decade. Currently, we're in Pastor Academy number 6. We also are launching a new Academy for Laity, and this is being spearheaded by one of our new staff members at quarter time, and that's the Reverend Dr. Joseph Patterson, who recently retired from the cabinet. And Joe has been working with me and others to put together a plan to model an academy similar to the Pastors Academy. And pastors aren't excluded from this process as well. They'll be invited to participate in some aspects of this Laity Leadership Academy. We also provide grants. Our board chair left us more than $1 million in 2001, and we've given nearly $800,000 away, and we still have the same amount of money that we had with the original gift, because we continue to distribute the income every year while the principal maintains its original amount. And finally, we do have a program to help churches with their strategy. It's called a Thriving and Faithful Church Initiative. And through a congregational assessment tool, churches can focus in on what they want to be about, what their strategy is, and how to make the tactical decisions to fulfill their vision and mission. Our objectives for today's webinar are as follows. 1, we want to define the dual status tax classification of ministers. This is an important understanding with regard to knowing how to properly complete the pastor's documentation on income, which is to file Form W-2. Also, describe the housing allowance, and also give you an example of what a completed pastor's Form W-2 might look like. The scope of today's webinar is to help treasurers complete their pastor's Form W-2. We also conduct a clergy tax seminar. This year we'll be conducting 2 clergy tax seminars for pastors, and treasurers are also invited to attend as well. Here's the information on those clergy tax seminars, and these are about 5.5 hours long. There's going to be one held February 22nd in Johnstown at the Holiday Inn. Also, there'll be one at the Conference Center in Cranberry on February 27th. This information is on our website, and also you'll get a copy of these slides, and a recording will be made available at the completion of the website today. Let's begin. Important ministerial tax issues for the IRS. You'll see a warning at the bottom of this slide that says misclassification of workers is a big issue with churches and the IRS. See IRS Publication 517. There are special rules that govern FICA and Medicare. There are special rules that govern self-employment tax. There are special rules for federal income tax withholding. And there are special rules for housing allowance. Here are some important ministerial tax issues continued. For the purpose of this webinar, a minister/pastor is ordained or licensed individual who has been appointed by the bishop to be in charge of a local church or churches. The pastor in this formal sense is the official representative of the annual conference and is responsible for serving effectively in the ministry of word, sacrament, and order in that appointment. In a less formal sense, pastor is a title synonymous with minister. Now, this definition is very important because it complies with what the IRS considers a minister to be. So, tip number one, who can be classified as a minister? For federal tax purposes, a minister is always credentialed, ordained, commissioned, or licensed, and a minister is compensated for performing ministerial duties, including some of or all of the following: performing of sacerdotal functions, that is, communion and baptism, for those of us who are United Methodists, conducting religious worship services, have a management responsibility in a local church, such as the executive pastor who's appointed, or maybe serving an extension ministry as a district superintendent, or having the high privilege to serve as the executive director of the United Methodist Foundation. Also, to teach or perform administrative duties in a seminary, or perform duties under a valid assignment from a church. Those are ministerial duties. Tip number two, we just saw who a minister is for federal tax purposes as defined by the IRS, but who is a minister for Department of Labor in employment roles? The courts have ruled that the employment laws do not apply to the relationship between a church and its ministers, thus excluding them from wage and hour and non-discrimination requirements. And so while these definitions are similar, the definitions of a minister for IRS purposes is not the same as the definition of a minister for Department of Labor purposes. Now, why should it surprise us that government agencies don't agree on things? Nonetheless, this webinar is not to discuss Department of Labor and employment roles, but to look at how to simply complete Form W-2. But it will play into play a little later on during the webinar. This Department of Labor definition may only be available to churches, doesn't have to be the predominant portion of the duties, and does not have to have ministerial credentials. And so someone, according to the Department of Labor, could be called a minister but not have ministerial credentials. However, for tax purposes and according to the IRS, a minister must have credentials, must be licensed, ordained, and carry out those functions that we talked about before. Tip number 3, classification for federal income tax. Self-employed individuals or income is earned outside the church, such as honorariums. So ministers who are credentialed and ordained do funerals, weddings, maybe write a book. That income is self-employment income and is reported on Schedule C in most instances. An employee of the church meets common law employee definitions. And some of those big ones are, do they participate in a benefit plan, a group plan? Is there a retirement and health care plan? or life insurance plan. Because of that, the correct reporting for clergy is for income to be reported on Form W-2. Some of you may remember, like I do, years ago when we clergy were given 1099s, miscellaneous income, instead of W-2s. But in the mid-90s, there was a court case called Weber versus the IRS Commissioner. And after that ruling came down, churches, even GCFA and the United Methodist Church, have encouraged people and told people you need to issue a W-2 to your pastor. And although a pastor is not an employee of the church, because the church doesn't hire and fire United Methodist pastors, and the bishop doesn't hire and fire pastors, the Board of Ordained Ministry sort of welcomes those who are ordained and holds them accountable in many regards. And they say who is appointable. And then the bishop simply appoints. United Methodist churches are the salary paying units and therefore have a responsibility to issue a W-2. Special rules, though, allow ministers to not have federal income tax withheld from his or her pay, but this does not mean that they are excluded from federal income tax overall. In fact, if a pastor completes Form W-4, they've given you permission to withhold their taxes for federal and state, but not FICA or SICA, and we'll see what those are in a moment. Classification for Social Security, tip number 4. There are 2 ways to pay into the Social Security system: the Self-Employed Contributions Act, SICA, or the Federal Insurance Contributions Act, FICA. The law says ministers receiving compensation from the performance of ministerial duties must pay in through SICA. There is not an option for ministers to pay in through FICA. Therefore, for Social Security only, ministers are self-employed and required to file Schedule SE, unless they have obtained an exemption by filing Form 4361. Housing allowance. This is not a deduction or an exemption. Internal Revenue Code Section 107 provides that the value of a home furnished or allowance paid to rent or provide a home may be excluded from federal income tax. And so it becomes the lesser of the amount of the resolution, the amount spent, or the fair market rental value. And so every year at your charge conference or at some other governing entity within the church, you have a housing allowance resolution. This housing allowance resolution is provided for the pastor so that she may have a amount that's excluded from federal income tax. That exclusion amount, again, is the lesser of the amount of the resolution, amount spent, or the fair market rental value. Housing allowance issues, it should be designated by the salary paying unit. You simply can't say, well, this makes sense, we'll have this amount as a housing allowance. It's got to be designated. It should be designated in advance of being paid. And so you can't say on December 15th, you know what, for 2018, I'd like to have a $20,000 housing allowance. It has to be in advance of being paid. Now, during the year, maybe the pastor would like to modify that amount, and the church is okay with that and approves that, but it can't exceed the amount that's going to be paid. So it has to be designated in advance. It must be designated in writing. It should be documented in church minutes, because if the pastor is ever audited, the pastor will want that in writing, that resolution, as part of the legal church minutes to account for that housing allowance. Here's some don'ts and do's. There's really only one do, but here's some don'ts with regard to the housing allowance. Do not report as wages on Form 941 or Box 1 of Form W-2. It's an exclusion. And because it's an exclusion, it doesn't show up in Box 1. Do not ask the minister to account for his or her housing expenses at the end of the year. There's a place on the form, on the tax form, where the pastor adds back in that which the pastor may not have spent. So if Pastor Jane had a housing allowance of $10,000, but is limited to $8,000 because of the lesser of the three criteria, Pastor Jane, she will add that $2,000 back in on her tax form as income. Do not pay to anyone who is having FICA or Medicare taxes withheld and matched. FICA and Medicare taxes are 7.65. As self-employed individuals, we pay the additional 7.65%. If you're matching that for your pastor, then you should not be providing her or him a housing allowance. Do pay a housing allowance to those properly classified as a minister in performing ministerial duties. If you're a church and you decided that you're going to hire someone and give them the title of pastor, but they're not credentialed, they're not licensed, they're not commissioned, they're not eligible for housing allowance. And that would be a situation where you would want to pay. They're an employee. They're not going to file self-employment income. That's a case where you would pay half of their FICA Medicare taxes. But then I always wonder, why are they a pastor why are they being called pastor if they're not credentialed, commissioned, or licensed and appointed by the bishop? Love gifts, the gift that's not a gift. Any amount received for the provision of services is not a gift, but is taxable income. Any gift received from an employer that is more than a small token item is taxable pursuant to Internal Revenue Code Section 102. So it's common in some churches to take up a collection to provide a love gift at Christmas time and give that to the church or to the pastor. Sometimes that's done through the books of the church. Number one, it's not a tax-deductible gift if it goes to the pastor as a special love gift. But also, more importantly, that is taxable income. That would be like a bonus and is taxable income and should be reported on Box 1 of Form W-2. A small token would be considered like maybe a ham, a turkey, a coffee mug. Gift cards are taxable income because they have cash value. Number 9, clergy case fact sheet. So here we have Pastor Susan. And Pastor Susan has a cash salary of $49,000. Her housing allowance is $10,000. She contributes 3% to her UMPIP. That amount is $1,470. She also has a health savings account of $1,000. So here are the boxes, here are the codes, how this would break down. Wage base box W2 box 1 is $36,530. Excluded from that is the housing allowance, the UMPIP, and the health savings account. State wage box 16 only excludes the health savings account. In Pennsylvania, the housing allowance is taxable. Also, contributions to 403Bs are also taxed. Even though it's pre-tax, that's for federal purposes, but for state purposes, it's not pre-taxed. The wonderful thing about Pennsylvania is there's no state tax on our retirement income from pensions. Also, local wage W2 box 18 is $38,000. The housing allowance is excluded, as well as the $1,000 HSA. UMPIP pre-tax, box 12A, code E, and E is for 403B. And then HSA, 12D is a code W, and it could go in box B, C as well, but I just happen to have it in box 12D for the sample. Code W is for HSA, and that's $1,000. So what this looks like is this. First United Methodist Church, Heavenbound Street, Anytown, PA. Pastor Susan B. Asbury, who lives at the parsonage on 123 Jesus Way. Up top, you can see that the wages, tips, and other compensation goes there. 12A is E, 1470. W code and 12D in the bottom right, $1,000. Local wages, $38,000. State wages, $48,000. Here are a couple of things to keep in mind. Any moving expenses paid in 2018 because of the new Jobs Act tax bill, moving expenses are taxable. Also, many of our pastors have had a salary arrangement for a Section 125 account to pay toward part of their premium for health care. If your church has more than 250 employees, you would put in the amount of the total that was paid for healthcare premiums, the church's portion and also the pastor's portion. However, because no church in Western Pennsylvania has more than 250 people, there's no reason to put that information on this W-2. It will be important for pastors to realize that because they've contributed to their health care in a pre-tax way toward the premium, they can't claim that as an expense and expect to try to get any type of deduction from their taxes. And we'll address that at the clergy tax seminar in February. So I'm going to take a look to see if there's any questions that have popped up. I don't see any questions. Let me drop the menu down. There are no questions that I'm seeing. But if you do have questions, feel free to send us an email and ask the question, and we'll try to provide some information that might be helpful. You'll also get a copy of this recording. You'll also get a copy of the slides, and we're also available to help in any way that you can. Thank you so much for joining in the webinar today. God's grace be with you, and have a great day.